What if you had everything? Royal blood, a throne, and a divine legacy, yet still failed to leave a lasting impact. This is the story of Abijah, the grandson of Solomon and the great-grandson of David. He inherited a kingdom torn apart by division, a people losing their faith, and an enemy twice as strong as his own army. Against all odds, he won a miraculous battle that should have been impossible. But was victory enough? His reign lasted only 3 years, and instead of restoring Judah, he repeated the same mistakes that had led to its downfall. His story is both a warning and a lesson about the difference between temporary faith and lifelong devotion. If you've ever wondered what it truly takes to honor God, you won't want to miss this. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an inspiring story like this one. Now, let's begin. Abijah was born into a world of shattered promises. His great-grandfather David had built an empire rooted in faith, courage, and an unbreakable bond with God. His grandfather, Solomon, had expanded that kingdom, ruling with unmatched wisdom and wealth. But by the time Abijah came into the world, all that was left was a broken remnant of what once was. His father, Rehoboam, had been given a kingdom united, strong, and blessed, only to divide it in a matter of days. Arrogance and recklessness had cost him 10 of Israel's 12 tribes, leading to a bitter civil war that tore God's chosen nation apart. Now, Judah stood alone, weakened and constantly under threat from the northern kingdom of Israel, led by the ambitious and rebellious Jeroboam. Abijah's childhood was not one of peace and prosperity. He did not grow up in golden palaces, basking in the security his ancestors had enjoyed. Instead, he was raised in the shadow of war. He would hear the distant clash of swords, the cries of soldiers returning wounded from battle, the whispers of fear that spread among the people. Every day, Judah braced itself for another attack, another loss, another humiliation at the hands of Israel. And yet, amidst all the chaos, Abijah must have wrestled with a question that burned deep in his heart. Could Judah be restored? Could he be the one to bring back the glory of his ancestors? But there was another problem, one far worse than war. Judah was not just politically divided, it was spiritually fractured. Yes, the temple of the Lord still stood in Jerusalem. Yes, the priests of God still performed their sacred duties. But Rehoboam, rather than strengthening Judah's faith, had allowed corruption to spread. Pagan altars rose across the land. The people of Judah, God's chosen people, had begun turning to false gods, blending the worship of Yahweh with idols and foreign rituals. And young Abijah watched it all. Did he resent his father for his failures? Did he look at the state of his kingdom and vow to be different? Or did he accept that this was just how things were now? Judah, broken and defeated, a shadow of what it once had been? One thing was certain. Whether he was ready or not, the weight of the throne would soon fall upon his shoulders. Rehoboam was growing weaker, his reign marked by one failure after another. And as the people of Judah lost their faith in their king, they also lost their faith in God. But what kind of king would Abijah be? Would he rise to the challenge, leading his people back to the God of David? Or would he continue in the same sins that had brought Judah to the edge of destruction? His moment was coming. His test of faith, of strength, of leadership was closer than he could have imagined. And when it arrived, the fate of Judah would hang in the balance. The day had finally come. Rehoboam was dead. His reign, marked by arrogance, division, and spiritual decay, had come to an unceremonious end. And now, at last, the throne of Judah belonged to Abijah. The weight of the crown pressed heavy upon his head. It was not just the physical weight of gold and jewels, but the weight of history, of expectation, of responsibility. Judah was not the kingdom it had once been. His great-grandfather David had ruled over a united nation. His grandfather Solomon had built a kingdom of wisdom and prosperity. but his father had lost it all. Now, Abijah stood at a crossroads. Would he be a king who restored Judah's strength? Or would he fall into the same traps that had ensnared his father? From the moment he took the throne, there was no time for celebration, no moment of peace. The enemy was watching, waiting. News of Rehoboam's death spread quickly across the land, reaching the ears of Jeroboam, the self-proclaimed king of Israel. To him, this was the perfect moment to strike. He had spent years solidifying his rule over the 10 tribes that had broken away. He had built his own altars, his own priesthood, his own gods. He had led the people of Israel into idolatry, severing their connection to the temple in Jerusalem. And now, with a new and untested king on the throne of Judah, Jeroboam saw an opportunity. War was coming. Abijah must have seen it in the eyes of his advisors, in the hurried movements of his generals, in the fearful whispers of the people. His kingdom was still wounded, still recovering from the failures of his father. His army was strong, but not as strong as Jeroboam's. His people still worshipped in the temple, but many had turned their hearts to other gods. Judah was fragile, and the enemy knew it. Abijah had a choice. He could submit, try to make peace, try to salvage what little remained of Judah's dignity. Or he could stand and fight he would. Standing in the royal halls of Jerusalem, Abijah clenched his fists. He was not blind to his father's failures. He knew the mistakes that had led them here. But there was one thing he still held on to, one thing he still believed. Judah was the kingdom of David, and God had promised that David's line would endure. That had to mean something. That had to count for something. With a deep breath, Abijah turned to his generals. "Prepare the army," he said. "We march to battle." The halls of the palace fell silent. His commanders exchanged uncertain glances. One of them, an older man with battle-worn hands and a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "Jeroboam's forces outnumber ours 2-1. This war, it is not one we can win." Abijah met his gaze, his voice steady. "We will not fight alone." For the first time in years, the halls of Judah's palace echoed with the voice of a king who still believed. Jeroboam thought he was facing an inexperienced ruler, but what he didn't know was that Abijah was stepping onto the battlefield with something far greater than swords and shields. He was stepping onto the battlefield with a promise. And when God makes a promise, he does not break it. The war for Judah's survival had begun. The air was thick with tension. The sun blazed overhead, casting long shadows over the dry earth. In the distance, dust clouds billowed, signs of an advancing army. Jeroboam had come. Abijah stood on the high ground of Mount Zemaraim, his eyes fixed on the enemy below. The army of Israel stretched far and wide, their banners fluttering in the hot wind. 800,000 men, a force that could swallow Judah whole. Behind him, Judah's warriors stood, their hands gripping their weapons, their faces taut with uncertainty. 400,000 against 800,000. The numbers alone spoke of defeat before the battle had even begun. A lesser king would have cowered. A lesser leader might have sought peace. But Abijah was no lesser king. He took a step forward, his voice rising over the battlefield like the sound of a trumpet. "Listen to me, Jeroboam, and all of Israel." His words carried across the valley, commanding attention, not just from his own men, but from the very army that sought to destroy him. The soldiers of Israel turned, their eyes narrowing as their king was openly challenged. "Do you not know that the Lord, the God of Israel, has given the kingship of this land to David and his descendants forever?" Abijah's voice was unshaken, filled with authority. "You, Jeroboam, are nothing more than a servant who rebelled against his master, Solomon. You have stolen this throne, built golden idols, and led Israel into sin." The murmurs in the enemy's ranks grew louder. Jeroboam's jaw tightened. "You have driven out the priests of the Lord. You have created your own priesthood, like the pagans who worship false gods. But we—" Abijah turned to his soldiers, his voice growing stronger. "We still stand with the Lord. We still offer sacrifices at his temple in Jerusalem. We still serve the God of our ancestors." The soldiers of Judah straightened, their hearts stirring. Abijah raised his arm, pointing at the enemy. "And because we stand with God, he will fight for us." For a brief moment, silence fell over the battlefield. Then Jeroboam gave the signal. Trumpets blared. The ground rumbled as thousands of Israelite soldiers surged forward, a wave of steel and flesh descending upon the army of Judah. But even as the battle began, something was wrong. The cries of war erupted not just in front of them, but behind. A realization crashed over the men of Judah. They had been surrounded. Jeroboam had outmaneuvered them. While Abijah had spoken, Israelite forces had moved into position behind them, cutting off every escape route. They were trapped. A wave of panic surged through the ranks. The warriors of Judah turned, their faces pale with fear. They were outnumbered, they were encircled, they were doomed. And yet, Abijah did not waver. "Call upon the Lord," his voice thundered above the chaos. "Blow the trumpets, let the sound of faith be heard." The priests, their hands trembling, lifted their trumpets and blew. A single note, piercing, defiant, desperate, rippled across the battlefield. And then another, and another. The sound echoed through the valley, a cry not of surrender, but of faith. And at that moment, God answered. The very earth seemed to tremble as confusion struck the army of Israel. Warriors who had once stood in perfect formation began to falter. Their movements became chaotic. Their confidence shattered. Abijah saw it. His warriors saw it. "Charge!" With renewed strength, the army of Judah surged forward, cutting through their enemies with supernatural might. The battle had begun as a massacre, but now it was a miracle. The battlefield was chaos. Swords clashed, shields splintered. The cries of men echoed through the valley, mixing with the sound of trumpets that still blared from Judah's ranks. Dust rose in thick clouds, stinging the eyes and choking the air. The warriors of Judah had gone into battle knowing they were outnumbered. But they had not expected this. They were surrounded. Jeroboam's strategy had worked flawlessly. While Abijah had been rallying his troops with his bold speech, the king of Israel had set his trap. His forces had moved behind Judah's army, cutting off every possible escape. Now, 400,000 warriors stood trapped between the hammer and the anvil, Jeroboam's 800,000-strong force closing in on both sides. A death sentence. For a brief moment, fear swept through Judah's ranks like wildfire. Men turned, eyes wide, searching for a way out. But there was none. The enemy was everywhere. A lesser army would have surrendered. A lesser king would have fallen to his knees in despair. But Abijah lifted his hands to the heavens and cried out to the Lord. It was not a whisper. It was not a quiet prayer spoken in the privacy of a temple. It was a roar, a desperate, faith-filled plea that carried above the clash of steel, above the screams of the wounded, above the war cries of Israel's army. And the priests of Judah? They raised their trumpets and blew. The sound was piercing, a defiant blast that cut through the battlefield like a blade. And in that moment, the impossible happened. God stepped in. A sudden panic gripped the army of Israel. Soldiers who had been so sure of their victory only moments before now stumbled over one another in confusion. Their movements became frantic, chaotic. Their once unshakable formation crumbled. The warriors of Judah felt it first, a shift in the air, a change in the tide. And then, Abijah saw his moment. "Charge!" he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. The men of Judah surged forward with renewed strength, cutting through their enemies with a force that could not have been their own. Jeroboam's soldiers, so confident, so sure of their advantage, began to fall. The panic spread like a plague through their ranks. Their weapons, once lifted with certainty, now trembled in their hands. The blood of Israelite warriors stained the battlefield as Judah struck with the fury of a people who knew they were not fighting alone. And the numbers began to shift. 500,000. That was the number of Jeroboam's soldiers who fell that day. A staggering, unthinkable defeat. Jeroboam, once so bold, so sure of his dominance, saw his great army crumble before his eyes. And suddenly, he knew. He had not just waged war against Abijah, he had waged war against God, and he had lost. The battlefield, once filled with the sound of war, grew eerily quiet. The dust settled. The warriors of Judah stood victorious, their breaths ragged, their bodies weary, but their faith unshaken. And yet, as Abijah looked out over the broken army of Israel, he did not celebrate, because deep in his heart he knew. A single victory does not make a kingdom strong, and faith in a battle means nothing if it does not last beyond the battlefield. The battlefield was silent. Where there had once been the thunderous clash of swords and the cries of warriors, now there was only the wind, whispering across the bodies of the fallen. The dust that had choked the air was settling, revealing the cost of war. Blood stained the ground, Israelite blood. 500,000 men. The number was staggering, unthinkable. Half of Jeroboam's army had been wiped out in a single battle. Judah, outnumbered and surrounded, had emerged victorious, not by strategy, not by strength, but by the hand of God. Abijah stood amidst his warriors, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. His sword, now slick with the blood of his enemies, hung heavy in his grasp. Around him, his men were catching their breath, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had won. But as Abijah surveyed the battlefield, he did not feel the overwhelming joy he had expected. He should have been triumphant. He should have been celebrating. But instead, a weight settled on his chest, one he couldn't shake. Victory had come, but was Judah truly saved? Jeroboam's fall. In the distance, the remnants of Israel's army were fleeing. Jeroboam himself had disappeared into the chaos, retreating back to his strongholds. The once mighty king who had defied God, who had led the 10 tribes into rebellion, was now a man undone. The battle had broken him. The Bible tells us in 2 Chronicles 13:20 that after this defeat, Jeroboam never regained power. His once thriving rule began to crumble, and in time, God struck him down, and he died. For Abijah, this should have been a sign, a moment of reckoning, a confirmation that Judah was still God's chosen kingdom, still under his divine protection. But even as Jeroboam fell, Abijah was left with a question that no victory could answer. The unfinished war. War is not just fought with swords. It is fought in the hearts of men. Yes, Judah had won this battle. Yes, their enemies had been crushed, their power shattered. But the true war, the war that had plagued Judah since the days of his father, was not fought on a battlefield. It was fought in the soul of the nation, and that war was far from over. Abijah had stood on Mount Zemaraim and boldly declared that Judah still served the Lord. But did they? Had his people truly turned back to God? Had he? The sins of his fathers still lingered. The high places of idol worship still stood. The altars to false gods remained scattered across the land. Victory on the battlefield meant nothing if Judah still walked in disobedience. The king's crossroads. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Abijah knew that his next battle would not be against Jeroboam. It would be against himself. Would he continue to lead Judah in the ways of faith? Or would he follow the same path of compromise that had weakened his father's reign? The people of Judah had seen a miracle. They had watched as God had fought for them. But miracles do not sustain a kingdom. Only faithfulness does. And faithfulness was a far harder battle to win. Victory had come, but it did not bring the peace Abijah had hoped for. For a brief moment, Judah stood tall. The impossible triumph over Jeroboam had sent shockwaves through the land. The people cheered their king, their faith renewed, their confidence restored. They believed, if only for a time, that Judah was strong again. But Abijah knew the truth. The battle had been won, but Judah was still broken. The enemy had been defeated on the battlefield, but not in the hearts of the people. A kingdom still divided. The streets of Jerusalem buzzed with life. Merchants filled the markets, traders moved through the city, and temple priests resumed their sacred duties. From the outside, Judah looked unshaken. But beneath the surface, cracks remained. Yes, the temple of the Lord still stood in Jerusalem. Yes, the priests of God still performed their sacrifices. But the altars to foreign gods remained scattered across the land. The people still worshipped idols. The same idolatry that had weakened Judah during his father's reign still thrived in the shadows. The golden calves of Jeroboam might have fallen in battle, but the real battle, the war for the hearts of Judah, was still being lost. And Abijah? He did nothing. The cost of complacency. At first, he may have told himself that change would take time, that after such a great victory, Judah would naturally turn back to God. But time passed, and nothing changed. The people still clung to their divided worship, offering sacrifices to God in the temple while still bowing before idols in secret. And instead of tearing down the altars, instead of leading his people back to full devotion, Abijah let it continue. The fire of revival never came. Judah was at peace, but peace without faith was an illusion. A king distracted. Instead of reforming Judah, Abijah focused on securing his political power. The Bible tells us in 2 Chronicles 13:19 that Abijah expanded Judah's borders, capturing several cities from Israel. He strengthened his military, fortified strongholds, and established his dominance in the region. But while he built walls around his kingdom, he failed to tear down the walls between his people and God. The victory he had won should have been a turning point. Instead, it became a moment wasted. The forgotten lesson. Abijah had seen firsthand what happened when Judah cried out to God. He had witnessed the miraculous deliverance of his army, the confusion that had overtaken Israel's forces. But miracles do not replace faithfulness. Winning a battle does not mean winning a war. And if a kingdom is not built on obedience, no amount of victories can save it. Abijah had stood on the battlefield and declared that Judah belonged to God. But what good are words if actions do not follow? As the years passed, Judah remained in its spiritual slumber. The people continued in their ways, worshiping both the Lord and the idols, and their king. He had chosen power over faith, success over surrender, victory over obedience. And in the end, it would cost him everything. Time passed. The battle was won. The kingdom was secure. Judah had expanded its borders, and for the first time in years, the land was at peace. But was it truly peace? Abijah sat upon the throne of his fathers. His name carried the weight of his lineage. The grandson of Solomon, the great-grandson of David. He was a king who had seen the power of God firsthand, who had stood on the battlefield and called upon the Lord for victory. And yet, despite everything he had witnessed, despite everything he had proclaimed, his heart was still divided. A king without a revival. The people of Judah still worshipped idols. The high places, the altars to foreign gods, still stood. The echoes of his father's sins had not faded. The people had not truly turned back to the Lord. And Abijah, instead of leading them in repentance, remained silent. He ruled Judah, but he did not restore it. He wore the crown, but he did not carry the faith. What good is a king who wins a war, yet loses the soul of his nation? The danger of forgetting. Had he forgotten how God had saved them? Had he forgotten how, when Judah had been surrounded, when all hope seemed lost, they had cried out to the Lord? and he had answered. Had he forgotten the fear in the eyes of Jeroboam's men as God struck them with confusion? Had he forgotten that it was not his sword, not his strategy, but God's power that had given him victory? It is easy to cry out to God when you are desperate. It is easy to turn to Him when there is no other choice. But what happens after the victory? When the battle is over, when the fear is gone, do we still cling to Him? Or do we return to our old ways, believing that we no longer need Him? A kingdom without a legacy. Abijah's reign lasted only 3 years. 3 years to lead, 3 years to bring his people back to God, 3 years to change the course of history. But he did not. Instead, he followed the same patterns as his father before him. The same sins, the same compromises, the same failure to fully commit to the Lord. And so, when his time was up, there was nothing to show for it. No great revival, no spiritual renewal, no lasting legacy. He had won a battle, but he had lost the war. The unfinished story. As Abijah's final days drew near, what thoughts filled his mind? Did he regret not doing more? Did he look at Judah, the land of his ancestors, the land of God's promise, and wonder what could have been? Did he wish he had torn down the idols? That he had called the people to repentance? That he had led them instead of merely ruling them? Or did he believe, even in his last moments, that victory in war was enough? The Bible tells us little about his death. He simply faded away, his reign ending as quickly as it had begun. And when he was gone, his son Asa took the throne. A son who would do what Abijah never did. A son who would break the cycle. A son who would truly turn Judah back to God. Because faith is not measured by the battles we win. It is measured by the life we live after the war is over. The echoes of war had faded. The blood had dried. The dust had settled. Judah stood victorious, its enemies scattered, its borders secured. The people went back to their homes, their daily lives resuming as if the great battle had never happened. But in the royal halls of Jerusalem, something was missing. Abijah had power. He had won battles. He had humbled Jeroboam. But he had not won Judah's heart. A king without transformation. The true battle had never been about swords or armies. It had been about faith. For all his bold words on the battlefield, for all his declarations that Judah still belonged to the Lord, his actions never followed. The high places of idol worship still stood. The shrines to false gods still remained. The same corruption that had weakened Judah before was still alive, unchallenged, untouched. And Abijah let it stay. Perhaps he thought himself strong because of his military victories. Perhaps he believed that as long as Judah was safe, as long as he sat on the throne, then everything was fine. But safety is not the same as righteousness, and a throne without a foundation will always fall. The weight of complacency. The years passed, and Abijah ruled. But his reign, though marked by success in battle, was short, empty of lasting change. The people continued to drift, caught between two worlds. They still sacrificed in the temple, but they also offered incense to idols. They still spoke of the God of their ancestors, but they also bowed to foreign gods. Their hearts were divided, and so was their king. Had he forgotten the promise of David, the covenant that God had made with his great-grandfather? That Judah would be strong only if they remained faithful? Had he forgotten the power of the Lord, the power that had saved them on the battlefield when all hope was lost? Or did he simply believe that victory in war was enough? A kingdom that stood still. Unlike his ancestors, Abijah left behind no great reforms, no laws calling the people back to holiness, no destruction of the altars to false gods, no movement to restore Judah's true devotion, nothing. And because of that, his name faded. The Bible does not record great celebrations at the end of his reign. There were no grand declarations of Judah's return to righteousness, no revival, only the quiet passing of a king who could have done so much more. The road not taken. What if he had led differently? What if he had done more than fight wars? What if he had not only spoken of God but walked with him? Would Judah have seen a revival? Would his reign have been remembered not just for a single battle but for a nation restored? We will never know, because he never took that road, and when his time was up, there was little to show for it. A brief reign, a moment of faith, a battle won, but a kingdom unchanged. And so the throne passed to his son, a son who would rise to undo what his father had failed to do, because while Abijah had worn the crown, he had never truly carried the weight of Judah's faith. The halls of the palace were quiet. Gone were the battle cries that once echoed through the land. Gone was the tension of war, the fear of destruction, the urgency of survival. Judah was at peace, yet it was a fragile, shallow peace, one that rested on the illusion of security rather than the strength of faith. And now, Abijah's time was running out. A king without a legacy. For 3 short years, he had ruled. He had stood on the battlefield and called upon the Lord, proclaiming that Judah belonged to the house of David. He had won a miraculous victory against an enemy twice his size. But what had he done since? The altars of foreign gods still stood. The people still lived with divided hearts. There was no great revival, no lasting reform, no return to the faith that had made Judah great. Abijah had fought to expand his borders, to secure his throne, but he had not fought for the hearts of his people. And so, as his strength faded, he faced the truth that no amount of political power could erase. He had ruled, but he had not led. The weight of regret. In his final days, did he remember the battle? Did he recall the moment when he had lifted his voice declaring before Israel that Judah still served the Lord? Did he think about how, in their greatest moment of desperation, his people had cried out, and God had answered? Did he wish he had done more? Had he looked at his kingdom, still tainted with idolatry, and realized that winning one battle had never been enough? Or did he tell himself that securing Judah's borders was all that mattered? That victory in war had made up for his failures in faith? The Bible does not tell us what went through his mind as he approached death. We only know this: his reign ended as quickly as it had begun, and Judah remained unchanged. A throne, passed to another Abijah, was buried in the city of David, joining the kings who had ruled before him. And then his son Asa took the throne, the son of a king who had seen miracles, who had witnessed divine intervention, but who had never truly lived for God. Would Asa follow the same path? Would he be just another king, passing through history without impact, leading Judah into the same cycles of half-hearted faith? Or would he be the one to restore what had been lost? Would he break the pattern, tear down the idols, and lead Judah back to God? The throne was his. The choice was his, and Judah's future would depend on it. The name Abijah should have been remembered among the greats. He was the grandson of Solomon, the great-grandson of David, a king who sat upon the very throne that God had promised to David's descendants forever. He had been given power, royal blood, and a kingdom rich with history and divine favor. But in the end, he was forgotten. The weight of a life. Unfulfilled Abijah had seen God's power firsthand. He had led Judah into an impossible battle and witnessed the miraculous hand of the Lord turn their defeat into victory. He had stood before Jeroboam's army, declaring with confidence that Judah still followed God. He had called on the name of the Lord when there was nowhere else to turn, and God had answered. But faith is not about moments. Faith is about a lifetime, and Abijah had only lived in moments of faith, never in the daily obedience that true leadership required. Yes, he had won a war, but he had lost a kingdom. Yes, he had spoken truth, but he had failed to live it. And so, when his time was over, nothing had changed. The idols still stood. The people still worshipped falsely. The kingdom remained spiritually broken. And Abijah, a man who had every opportunity to restore Judah, left behind no great legacy. The king who could have been. What if he had been different? What if he had not only spoken of faith but walked in it? What if he had led Judah into true repentance instead of settling for political security? What if he had used his victory not just as a moment to boast, but as an opportunity to rebuild the people's devotion to God? His name would have meant something. His reign would have left a mark. Instead, he faded. 3 years, that was all he had. And when it was over, he left Judah just as he had found it, divided, weakened, still in need of a leader who would truly turn them back to God. That leader would not be him, but it would be his son, Asa. The legacy that mattered. Abijah is not remembered as a great king. He is not celebrated for his wisdom, his leadership, or his faithfulness. But his story is a warning, because it is easy to call on God in moments of crisis. It is easy to trust him when we are surrounded, when there is no other way out. But what happens when the battle is over? What happens when we are safe? When the crisis has passed? Do we still follow him? Do we still obey him? Or do we return to the same mistakes, the same sins, the same divided heart that led us into trouble in the first place? Abijah's story teaches us that a single moment of faith is not enough, because God does not want just our desperation. He wants our devotion. And a throne without faith is as empty as a victory without obedience. What will your legacy be? If you were to die today, what would you leave behind? Would you be remembered for your faithfulness, or would your name fade, a reminder of what could have been? Abijah had everything, and yet, in the end, he had nothing. But his son, Asa, would be different. The throne now belonged to a king who would do what Abijah never did. A king who would restore. A king who would tear down the idols. A king who would bring Judah back to God. Because faith isn't just about winning battles. It's about living in obedience every day after the battle is won.